My son's kidneys were failing. The doctors said the safest treatment could save him, but it wasn't covered by insurance. I didn't panic. I called my parents, the owners of one of the biggest food companies in the state. I thought they'd help. They didn't just say no, they told me his illness was just bad luck. Weeks later, the medical report proved exactly where that luck came from, and it had their company's name all over it. My name is Evelyn Cross. I'm 34, single mom. I design water filtration systems for a living. On a Tuesday morning in late September, my son Micah collapsed in the kitchen. No warning. 1 second he was making coffee. The next he was on the floor, gasping, his face pale like paper. The ER was only 7 minutes away, but the drive felt like I was steering through wet cement. Every traffic light was red. Every minute was a dare I couldn't win. At the hospital, they hooked him to machines faster than I could ask questions. Dr. Harris, someone I knew from college, was the one who told me. His kidneys are shutting down, Evelyn. We need to act fast. 2 options. Standard dialysis, covered by insurance but risky, and could leave him needing a transplant. Gen 4 nanofiltration treatment, 98% success rate, minimal long-term damage but no coverage, and a price tag that made my stomach twist. I didn't hesitate. "We'll go with the Gen 4, I said. He nodded, but his eyes stayed heavy. "We have a small window. If you can secure payment authorization by tomorrow morning, we'll be ready." I had savings, but not that much, so I stepped into the hallway and called the people I thought would step up. My parents, Gordon and Lillian Cross, owners of Cross Foods, a company that had their name plastered across billboards, grocery aisles, and charity galas. My dad picked up, warm and casual. "Hey, Evie, everything okay?" "No, it's Micah. He's in renal failure. There's a treatment that could save him, but it's not covered. I need help." A pause, too long, then my mom's voice cut in on speaker. "Oh, honey, sometimes these things just happen. It's bad luck." "No, this isn't about luck. This is about a chance to save his life. I need the money." Dad sighed. "It's not a good time. Damien's finalizing the export deal to Tokyo. Every cent is tied up in the business." "Then untie it. We can't jeopardize the company for one procedure," Mom said softly, like she was soothing a child. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. They weren't going to help, and I didn't know yet that they were the reason Micah was dying in the first place. I signed the consent for the standard dialysis. It wasn't the choice I wanted to make. It was the one I could afford. Micah didn't complain. He just stared at the ceiling while the machine hummed beside him. His knuckles were pale from gripping the blanket. Dr. Harris came by that night with the first lab results. Heavy metals, cadmium, traces of lead, levels high enough to shut down a healthy adult's kidneys, and Micah was 17. "Evelyn, this didn't come from nowhere," Harris said quietly. "This pattern, I've seen it before, from industrial runoff." The words landed in my chest like ice water. We lived 3 miles from the main water line, 2 miles from the Cross Foods processing plant, a plant my father bragged about modernizing last year. Harris leaned in, his voice lower now. "The isotopic signature in the cadmium. It matches the samples from that plant's waste reports, the ones they filed in 2025. I froze. Their company. He studied my face for a beat. "You didn't hear this from me, and if you want to do anything about it, you'll need more than my word." That night, I didn't sleep. I read every water quality report I could pull from public records, and then I hit the paywall, the private audits, the ones only regulators and shareholders could see. But I wasn't just any resident. I still held 3% of Cross Foods stock, a token inheritance from my grandmother they'd never bothered to buy out. It gave me access, and access gave me the truth. The waste discharge logs for the past year had corrections scribbled into the margins, numbers that didn't line up, dates that overlapped with the month Micah's symptoms began. I printed everything. 74 pages. Each one felt heavier than the last. Somewhere between page 40 and 50, my hands stopped shaking because I realized something. They hadn't just refused to save him. They'd poisoned him first. The next morning, I called the county land records office. If the plant's waste pond was leaking into our water, I needed to know who actually owned that land. The clerk pulled the file. I heard her scrolling, then pausing. That parcel used to be under your name, MS, Cross, transferred to Cross Foods 4 years ago. My grip on the phone tightened. 4 years ago, that was the same summer my father had asked me to help the family by signing what he called routine paperwork. He'd said it was a minor zoning update. No big deal. I was tired, juggling 2 jobs, and I trusted him enough not to read the fine print. I asked the clerk to send me everything. She hesitated. There's something else. The transfer was notarized, but the signature on record doesn't match the one we have for you from other filings. Forgery on my own inheritance, and that land, my land, was now the dumping ground that had poisoned my son. By noon, the email arrived. The scan deed had my name in looping cursive, but not my hand. They hadn't even bothered to get it right. I printed it. Then I drove past the plant. From the highway, I could see the waste reservoir, a shimmering, sickly green under the Colorado sun. It sat exactly where my grandmother's orchard used to be. I remembered the smell of those summers, pine and peaches. Now it was chemical rot. Micah's voice echoed in my head from a week before. "Mom, my hands keep tingling. Is that normal?" No, it wasn't, and neither was any of this. They hadn't just taken land. They'd taken the one safe thing my grandmother had meant for me to pass to him, and they'd turned it into a slow weapon. That night, I called Renee Vale, a name I hadn't said in 10 years. The best environmental litigator I knew. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Evelyn," she said finally, "we're not just going to sue them, we're going to bury them." Renee didn't waste time. By the next morning, she was in my kitchen, coffee in one hand, a legal pad in the other. Micah was still asleep upstairs. "We're going to need proof that ties their plant to the contamination in Micah's blood," she said, "and we're going to get it without them knowing we're coming." Step 1, secure the chain of evidence. We drove to 3 different collection sites downstream from the waste reservoir, each one closer to residential wells. Renee wore gloves, sealed every jar, documented every GPS coordinate. Step 2, match it to the medical samples. Dr. Harris didn't hesitate. He printed the full toxicology panel and signed an affidavit on the spot. He didn't even ask about payment. "You're not the first family they've hurt," he said quietly. The weight of that sentence stayed with me all day. Step 3, track the paper trail. Renee's investigator, a retired state auditor, dug into Cross Foods' financial filings. 2 things jumped out: multiple environmental compliance fees paid to a private firm in cash, a sudden spike in waste processing expenses right after the date my land was transferred to them. By Friday, we had enough to file for a temporary injunction to freeze their assets tied to the plant. It wouldn't shut them down, but it would scare them. Renee leaned back in her chair, scanning the stack of evidence between us. "We're going to hit them where they think they are untouchable, their reputation." The first strike wasn't in court. It was in the press. Monday morning, an investigative piece hit the Denver Chronicle. Local teen in kidney failure after alleged Cross Foods contamination. Family connection raises questions. They didn't use my name. Not yet, but they used his, Micah's, and they used the phrase alleged relative refused to assist with medical costs. By noon, the comments were vicious. Stock price down 6%. Reporters camped outside the Cross Foods HQ. That night, my phone buzzed. A text from my father, "We need to talk. Urgent." I didn't answer. This was just the first move, and I was far from done. They chose the place, the glass conference room at Cross Foods HQ. They probably thought it gave them the upper hand. It didn't. When I walked in, my father was already standing, arms folded, trying for that CEO glare he used to use on nervous reporters. My mother sat stiffly at the head of the table, a gold pen in her hand like she was chairing a board meeting. "Evelyn," my father started, what you've been allowing the press to publish, it's damaging. Not just to the company, but to all of us." "All of us." I set my folder down. "You mean you, Mom, and Damien, because Micah sure isn't part of that us, is he?" My mother's lips tightened. "We've always cared about Micah." I slid the first document across the table, the forged land deed. Her sentence tripped over itself. My father reached for it. I pulled out the second sheet, the waste discharge logs. "This," I said, "is what's been running into our water. And this," I tapped the toxicology report Harris signed, "is what's in Micah's blood." Silence. Even the hum of the HVAC seemed to pause. "You can't prove that's connected," my father tried, his voice tighter now. "That's the thing," I said, leaning forward. "I already can, and so can my lawyer, and so can the State Environmental Board I sent copies to this morning." My mother's pen slipped from her fingers. It hit the table with a sound sharper than it should have been. "Evelyn, you don't understand what this will do to us," she whispered. "Oh, I understand perfectly." I stood, gathering the papers back into my folder. "This isn't about what it will do to you. It's about what you've already done to him." I didn't wait for a reply. As I reached the door, my father's voice chased me. "You think you're going to win?" I looked back just long enough to say, "No, I don't think, I know." The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time since Micah collapsed in my kitchen, I felt like the ground under my feet belonged to me again. The first day of the trial, the courtroom felt too small for the weight of what we were bringing in. Rows of press. Environmental activists in faded, clean water now shirts. Neighbors who'd lost pets, crops, even pregnancies after the plant expanded. Micah sat beside me upright, no headphones, no phone, just watching. His hands were steady. Renee started with the land deed. Projected 10 feet tall on the wall behind the judge, my forged signature looked even uglier in black and white. Then came the waste discharge logs, the altered numbers, the identical handwriting on corrections that matched my father's signature from other documents. The defense tried to bury it under jargon. They called the contamination trace exposure, the health effects statistically insignificant. It didn't stick. Then Renee called Dr. Harris. He walked the court through Micah's toxicology report, line by line, until the room was dead quiet. Finally, he said it plainly. The isotopic signature of the cadmium in his blood is a fingerprint, and it matches the waste from Cross Foods reservoir exactly. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge banged the gavel. The breaking point came when Renee produced the internal email chain we'd pulled from their own servers, the one where my brother Damien wrote, "We can't afford another waste treatment upgrade. Just move the runoff limit line on the report. No one's going to test the downstream wells." I watched my father's jaw clench. My mother didn't look at me once. By the end of the second week, the judge ruled in our favor. Full medical costs covered, damages for environmental harm to the community. The land deed voided, the orchard site returned to my name, and an order for the plant to cease operations until new systems were installed. It wasn't prison, not yet, but it was the first crack in the shell they'd built around themselves. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Someone asked me if this was justice. I looked at Micah, then back at the cameras. Justice is still coming. 2 months after the civil verdict, the DA called. The investigation had gone deeper than I expected. Not just environmental violations, not just forged documents, criminal negligence, fraud, conspiracy to falsify state reports. The evidence was damning, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. Wire transfers from company accounts to the consulting firm that falsified lab results. Invoices for waste relocation that never happened. And the kicker, a memo signed by my father and Damien, authorizing the disposal of untreated waste after regulators had ordered upgrades. The DA didn't just file charges. They froze every personal and corporate account tied to my parents and brother. Vacation properties, seized. Stock portfolios, locked. The private jet Damien liked to post on Instagram, grounded and impounded. When the trial began, they came in without their tailored suits. No silk scarves, no gold pens. Just the county jail's gray jumpsuits, shackles clinking with every step. The defense tried for a plea bargain. The DA refused. The verdict, Gordon Cross, 3 years in state prison. Lillian Cross, 18 months. Damien Cross, 2 years, plus a lifetime ban from holding any corporate officer position in the state of Colorado. They were let out in cuffs, past the same neighbors they'd once posed with at charity galas. No one reached for them. No one called their names. When it was over, I walked out with Micah. The orchard land was ours again. We'd already started clearing the poisoned soil, planting the first rows of saplings, peaches and pines, just like my grandmother had. Micah stopped at the edge of the field, the wind cutting sharp through the air. "Do you think they'll ever understand what they did?" I shook my head. "Some people don't deserve understanding, just consequences." He didn't smile, but he didn't look back either, and neither did I.